Deep Sea Embers chapter 291-300. Upon hearing the priest of the god of death speak before him, the elderly caretaker didn't comply immediately as an ordinary gravedigger might. Instead, he furrowed his brow in displeasure. I am this graveyard's caretaker, and I've never been told the caretaker must leave during any events here. Sir, this is an exceptional circumstance, interjected the short man in black, speaking with sincerity and gravity. Noticing the resolute expression on the old caretaker's face, he eventually sighed. All right, I wasn't meant to divulge this, but the body is being transported to the silent cathedral. The silent cathedral? The old caretaker inquired reflexively. What's going on? An extreme, unidentified contamination, potentially linked to something deep within the mines. A unique purification ritual is required, and it's best if fewer living people are present, the short man stated gravely. Not only must you leave, but my colleague and I will also need to accompany you. As he spoke, the tall, muscular man in black also came forward and stood quietly beside the short man. The old caretaker glanced at the pair of black-garbed priests before him and then at the woman in black near the corpse platform. She had already removed the herbs and holy oil for the ritual, setting up a makeshift altar on the ground in front of the platform. Fine. Since this involves mines and contamination, it's not my concern, the old man finally relented. He shrugged, grabbed his shotgun, and headed towards the graveyard path while calling back to the tall and short men in black, follow me, there's hot tea in my hut. You can also warm yourselves by the fire, the graveyard gets colder at night than outside. The two men in black exchanged looks and casually expressed their gratitude as they trailed the old man. Thank you for your hospitality, sir. With the old caretaker and the two men in black gone, only the thin-lipped woman in black and the taciturn, gaunt man remained near the corpse platform. And a now silent casket, of course. Duncan lay still in the coffin, pondering his conversation with the caretaker while speculating on the background of the unanticipated guests who arrived later. During the journey to Frost, things indeed differed from his time with Plant. Though it didn't seem to be going smoothly, it possessed its own distinct allure. His only dissatisfaction stemmed from the inefficiency of his current body. Inside, Duncan raised his hand and watched a small green flame flicker on his fingertip, casting light in the confined space. Thankfully, the ghost fire's efficacy remained unaffected. In the dim green glow, he observed the cheap, low-quality wooden boards, the rough linen lining, the intricate runes on the coffin lid, and the triangular emblem at the center of the runes. This symbol likely represented Bartok, the god of death. The runes and emblem were evidently not some refined craftsmanship, either, but more likely machine-printed. The outcome was essentially the same. Duncan strained to listen intently to the sounds outside the coffin. The coffin was quite thin, and the seal wasn't secure, allowing Duncan to clearly hear the conversations outside. He had just heard the caretaker and the two uninvited guests departing, and now he detected rustling noises as though the remaining individuals were moving around the coffin. What were they planning to do? The woman in black halted her preparations of the altar in front of the corpse table. She rose, glanced in the direction the caretaker had departed, and after confirming the obstinate old man was far enough away, she spat on the ground before coming towards the coffin and knocking over the altar she had arranged. The silent man in black had already approached the coffin, flicking his staff so that the metal hook on the end sprung out, transforming into a crowbar. Wait a moment, the woman in black stopped her companion, then came to the coffin and tapped it with her fingers. Are you still in there? Ah, yes, Duncan responded promptly. Need something? The woman in black furrowed her brow, appearing slightly puzzled, but then spoke impassively. Do you know who you are? I'm not certain, Duncan casually lied. Actually, I'm still baffled about how I ended up here. And just now a graveyard caretaker informed me that I was dead and would be cremated in 3 days. What happened? And what are you doing here? Ah, we're here to assist you, the woman in black stated indifferently. You don't want to be cremated, right? Of course not. Although Frost's winters are indeed frigid, warming up in the crematorium is excessively extreme. Are you going to let me out? Your chilly joke is as cold as this night, sir, the woman in black chuckled. Naturally. We'll release you. All you need to do afterward is accompany us, and you won't have to worry about anyone bothering you again. Thank you. The voice inside the coffin expressed gratitude politely. Ads by PubFuture. The woman in black composed herself, stepped back slightly, and gestured to the quiet man wielding the crowbar. Pry it open. The silent man advanced, and with a creaking noise, the already fragile coffin was soon unlocked. He then pushed the dark coffin lid aside using his staff, allowing the cover to drop heavily to the gravel. However, instead of making a loud thud from the act, the coffin lid instantly disintegrated into dust at the woman's silencing gesture. Subsequently, the two impostors now had a clear view of the coffin and its occupant, a pallid man with large hands and feet, dressed in a dark brown coat, sat up from within and studied them curiously. Ah, this is becoming interesting. After a moment, a faint smile appeared on Duncan's face, and he sighed as if appreciating the sight. What did you just say? The woman in black frowned, then immediately adopted a stern expression and commanded in a deep voice imbued with a peculiar power, "First, step out of the coffin and depart with us." There's no rush. Duncan sat in the coffin, shaking his head with a smile. Your chains are quite distinctive, as are your shadow demons. I thought they only existed in legends. Upon hearing this, the man and woman in black appeared momentarily stunned. In the next instant, they looked shocked, and the thin-lipped woman even subconsciously took a step back, gazing at Duncan with a blend of astonishment and caution. You can see through our disguises. Disguise. Duncan raised his eyebrows, his gaze sweeping over the two individuals before him. A woman clad in a long dark-colored skirt, her face thin and harsh. A black chain emerged between her neck and collarbone, evidently attached to her body, as though it extended directly from her collarbone. At the end of the chain was a grotesque creature composed of twisted black bone plates. The creature, an odd bird, was enveloped in black smoke and perched steadily on the woman's shoulder. Its two blood-red hollows stared intently at Duncan, and each bone plate on its body quivered slightly. The other person was a thin man wearing a thick gray-blue coat. A chain extended directly from his throat, the other end connected to a massive floating jellyfish. The jellyfish appeared insubstantial, its entire body comprised of drifting smoke, with a blood-red core pulsating like a heart at its center. Black chains and eerie, smoke-shrouded creatures lived symbiotically. Undoubtedly, they were two members of the Annihilation sect. And at this moment, both cultists appeared astonished. Ah, yes, the disguise. Duncan eventually nodded, then slowly rose from the coffin and cautiously descended from the platform. His movements were sluggish because this body wasn't particularly useful. It seems that disrupting cognition and aiding symbiotes in concealing their identities is a talent of yours. Is this a common technique for all of you? However, I must say, your disguising skill is not very reliable. I've never seen a flawless execution. Stop. The female cultist finally reacted. She abruptly retreated several steps, then pointed at Duncan, her voice mingled with another deep, raspy tone, as if another spellcaster was reciting a curse through her throat. I strip you of your ability to move and command you to halt right here. Duncan ultimately stepped down from the platform, took two more leisurely strides forward, and curiously observed the woman not far away. So, this is the so-called curse that the Annihilation sect borrowed from the demons. Well, I must admit, it is indeed more sophisticated than I anticipated. However, it appears that its effectiveness is not as impressive as I had imagined. At least it doesn't startle me as much as it should, like Meteor Dog would. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Under the sway of the Symbiotic Pact, the invocation that sought to expose the clandestine wisdom of the Shadow Demon turned out fruitless. The spell's failure struck the two Annihilation cultists present with more shock than a risen corpse would have caused. Moreover, the Death Crow was among the most formidable shadow demons in terms of magical capabilities. The slender woman, draped in a black skirt, stared in disbelief at the quietly standing, apparently resurrected, figure before her. Concurrently, she sensed an anomaly with the Death Crow, a being she was bound to through chains extending from her collarbone. The shadow demon repeatedly issued perilous signals, even making attempts to break the connection with its master and retreat to its mystical realm. At last, she reacted, deftly seizing the chain beneath the death crow with one hand and clenching thin air with the other while locking eyes with Duncan. "Something is awry. You are not the deceased. Who are you? Before that, tell me who you are." Duncan gazed at the woman before him, then shifted his focus to the silent man nearby, who still clutched his crowbar staff, and maintained a safe distance from him. "Let me venture a guess. You are evidently no envoy of the death god. You tricked the guard with, let's say, deception skills. You came for me, or more precisely, for the body I am currently occupying. Is my guess accurate?" The woman in the black skirt opened her lips slightly, her mouth moving as though to speak, but Duncan failed to make out her words. In the next moment, she abruptly raised her previously clenched right hand, and the faint murmur from her mouth morphed into a spine-chilling shriek. Concurrently, the death crow demon perched on her shoulder spread its wings wide. Bound by the symbiotic pact, this shadow demon was forced to repress its inherent fear and launch an attack on Duncan. A palpable pressure emerged, accompanied by an abnormal trembling and distortion of the ground beneath them. The earth around Duncan started rippling like liquid, and several colossal black thorns, akin to bone spurs, erupted from the ground, curling themselves around him. However, Duncan displayed no sign of evasion, primarily because his terrifyingly fragile temporary body couldn't execute such swift maneuvers. He merely observed the encroaching thorns as they enwrapped him. Then, a radiant spiritual flame burst forth from within the thorny snare, instantaneously reducing the spell-summoned thorns to a mound of ebony ashes, with a few scattered sparks fading into the wind. "I told you, you would do better to hurl that crow on your shoulder at me. That might actually give me a slight fright." Duncan sighed resignedly, but as his words trailed off, he perceived a disconcerting sensation in his body. He lifted his hand instinctively, and the next instant, he was aghast to see cracks forming on both his hands. These were not wounds inflicted by the earlier thorns, but spontaneous cracks. As Duncan watched, the cracks continued to expand, as though the skin and muscles of this body had suddenly lost their vitality and suppleness, rapidly fracturing in the dry, icy air. The cracks oozed only a meager flow of blood, while desiccated, shriveled fragments persistently fell from the wounds to the ground. Within a matter of seconds, Duncan could distinctly sense the already feeble body becoming even more delicate. He observed the strange metamorphosis of his body with a sense of wonder, then shifted his gaze to the woman in the black skirt across from him. Is this another effect of the curse? Did it finally take hold? The woman in the black skirt seemed as if she was still reeling from the shock of the utter annihilation of her thorns. Her complexion had grown notably paler, and the death crow on her shoulder drooped its head in exhaustion. However, upon hearing Duncan's words, a faint smile crept across her face. "Ah, it seems this body is nearing its breaking point. That makes things significantly simpler." Nearing its breaking point, Duncan echoed involuntarily, apparently inferring something from her words and demeanor. But before he could voice his thoughts, the woman in the black skirt issued a cold command: "Attack." Her command set the silent, gaunt man beside her into motion. He stared blankly at Duncan as the floating demon, resembling a combination of smoke and a jellyfish, pulsed rhythmically. A mass of dark matter, sizzling with vapor, burst from the jellyfish-like body, barreling toward Duncan like an incendiary projectile. However, the acidic cannonball had already transformed into a faint green hue midway through its flight and crumbled before reaching its intended target. The dissolution was soundless and left no trace. Duncan looked bemusedly at the exploding mass of dark matter. "I tried to tell you, this thing doesn't." Before he could finish, the smoke and sparks hanging in midair had disappeared. As the smoke cleared, he noticed the silent man nearby lifting his staff toward him, its tip splitting in the middle, revealing a large caliber gun barrel. Bang! The gun barrel erupted with a blast of flame, but the sound didn't permeate beyond the mortuary platform. The woman in the black skirt had already raised her finger to execute a silencing gesture. The large caliber bullet sliced through the air, generating a muted rumble within the hushed vicinity. Duncan's eyes tracked the bullet's final trajectory, but he made no move to evade. He merely glanced sideways at the silent man, host to the jellyfish-like demon. The next second, his vision plunged into darkness. The potent impact of the specially crafted bullet obliterated his head, leaving nothing above his neck. Duncan's body swayed, stood still for a contemplative moment, raised its hand to probe the area above its neck, and found nothing. It then extended its hand toward the woman in the black skirt and the silent man, gesturing rudely before collapsing backward. The woman in the black skirt fixated her gaze on the eerie and terrifying headless body. Ads by PubFuture. She witnessed her partner blow the body's head off with a single shot, watched the body raise its hand to feel its vanished head, and saw the bizarre actions that a headless body shouldn't be capable of. Whatever it was, the entity that had inhabited that body had undoubtedly not perished. It had merely departed, a transient banishment. Coming to terms with the dangerous situation, the woman in the black skirt resolved to abort the mission for the day. She quickly turned to her companion. "We need to leave. Once we're out of the graveyard, signal the others. Something is critically wrong today." The taciturn man holding the peculiar staff remained frozen for a moment, as if failing to comprehend his companion's urgency. He stood in quietude, and along the inky chain jutting from his throat, a fleeting spark of green danced and extinguished. That spark had once journeyed along the chain, seeping into his flesh and blood, signifying his heart was already set ablaze. "Hey, are you listening?" The stern and impatient voice of the woman in the black skirt resounded again. "We must depart swiftly, lest our upheaval today attracts the Guardian's gaze." The lanky man with the staff nodded and gradually pivoted around. "What just happened to you?" The woman in the black skirt scrutinized her comrade but swiftly dismissed her concern. "Never mind, let's move at once, Duncan." "Indeed," Duncan responded with a smile, "it wouldn't do well to tarry here." The woman in the black skirt nodded, readying to pivot around and tread up the path, but just as she made her move, the death crow that had always nestled on her shoulder suddenly erupted into a harsh, eerie caw. The bones of the shadow demon rattled and the obsidian smoke swirled as it abruptly swiveled its head to fixate a stern gaze at Duncan, emitting peculiar cracking sounds while its wings flapped erratically. Behind Duncan, the jellyfish-shaped shadow demon levitating in the air spontaneously combusted. Amidst the dense black smoke and blazing fire, the incorporeal jellyfish demon was reduced to cinders within seconds, and the chain binding the symbiote released a series of harsh clinking sounds, crumbling into fragmented links on the ground. The woman in the black skirt abruptly froze, receiving an overwhelming sense of dread and a portent of doom through the death crow's link. She even vaguely experienced the visual feedback of the death crow's gaze. When the demon on her shoulder swiveled to face Duncan, a jolt of pain surged through her brain, reminiscent of a needle's prick. An indescribable array of distorted light and shadows swarmed her reddened vision, as though her retinas were set ablaze. Typically, shadow demons don't possess hearts, they operate purely on instinct. When facing colossal danger, they wouldn't extend the same courtesy to their masters as dog would to Shirley, taking their mental well-being into account. "Ah!" The woman in the black skirt released a low groan, instinctively backpedaling in pain and confusion. She found support on a nearby street lamp, her eyes wide with terror as she gawked at the familiar yet alien, slender figure standing at the precipice of light and shadow. What are you?" Duncan cast a glance at the grotesque skeletal creature perched on the woman's shoulder, undeniably more repulsive than I, and then at the black ashes scattered behind him, sighing in regret. "Ignorance indeed can be bliss," he shook his head, "but it seems your fortune has worn thin." The moment Duncan said, "Ignorance is bliss," the woman in the black dress had already reacted. But this time, she didn't attempt any futile combat actions. Instead, she tightened her grip on the chain beneath the death crow's feet with one hand and waved the other behind her, conjuring a hazy black fog in the air. Then she turned around and sprinted towards the cemetery entrance. She could no longer concern herself with her possessed companion or the two other accomplices engaged with the Guardian. The strange events of the night had exceeded her comprehension. Even as a devotee of annihilation who had signed a contract to coexist with a shadow demon, she was nearing the limits of her sanity and courage. She needed to leave this place, the farther and faster, the better. She didn't want to remain in the sight of the invisible and indescribable intruder or continue to share space with the terrifying shadow. Duncan furrowed his brow. He hadn't fully adapted to the body he had just occupied. Although he could clearly feel that this body was in better health than the one in the coffin, he still had difficulty keeping pace with the fleeing woman. Nevertheless, he pursued her, slicing through the eerie black fog she conjured while escaping, adapting to his new body, and focusing his gaze on her retreating figure. As he watched her, the gas lamps she passed suddenly flickered, their bright and stable flames tainted with a touch of deep green. The contaminated lamps seemed like invisible footsteps, trailing the fleeing cultist's shadow swiftly towards the cemetery entrance and sprinkling a path of green sparks that grew closer and more numerous. But just as the green flames scattered by the lamps were about to catch up with the cultist, the grotesque crow made of black bones suddenly screeched and took flight. Its jagged wings dispersed large swaths of smoke in the night sky while its piercing cry seemed to tear through a small area of space-time. Suddenly, Duncan saw large rifts in the darkness beside the cultist, which merged into a massive black hole. The skeletal crow shrieked frantically and fearfully, recklessly charging towards the dark portal that appeared out of nowhere. The chain extending from its feet instantly went taut, and with a grating noise, the woman in the black dress was suddenly dragged towards the unknown. "Damn it! Stop! You bastard! You beast!" The cultist struggled desperately, shouting in an altered tone, her voice overflowing with uncontrollable fear and despair. "No, no, no! Don't take me to the abyss! Help! Help! No, no!" With a final scream, the cultist was dragged into the pitch-black hole by the chain, and the hole closed with a howl, eventually dissipating into a trembling shadow. A sprinkling of faint green light from the lamps on both sides illuminated the empty cemetery path. "That's quite a unique escape route," Duncan observed the sudden scene with some bewilderment. It took him a while before the corner of his mouth twitched, and then he seemed to remember something. "That's how Shirley and Dog escaped back then, isn't it? But I remember she wasn't scared at all at the time, was she?" He furrowed his brow, gazing in the direction where the cultist vanished, but after contemplating for a moment, he gained nothing and could only look away. The greenish lamplights on both sides returned to normal as he averted his gaze, and the intertwined dim shadows gradually retreated to his feet as if retracting tendrils in the darkness. At this moment, a faint crackling sound reached Duncan's ears. Turning at the source with a puzzled look, he discovered it was in fact coming from his own body. Fine crackling sounds kept coming from various parts of his body, and between the gaps in his clothing, wisps of black smoke could be seen seeping and rising. Duncan was momentarily stunned, uncertain of this unexpected situation. Then he suddenly pulled open his clothes near his chest and finally saw the changes happening to his body. His flesh was turning into a black, charred substance bit by bit, and many gaps had appeared on the wrinkled skin's surface, from which black smoke and ashes emerged like they were coming from a pile of firewood. If it weren't for having accepted the open-hearted initiation from the beginning, this bizarre and terrifying scene would have definitely shocked Duncan. But he was now accustomed to such strange and sinister events and remained exceptionally calm, even reaching out to touch his neck. The change seemed to have started from the throat, the place where the shadow demon had once coexisted and connected to the chains. Duncan immediately thought of the self-immolating jellyfish-like shadow demon from before. After he had taken over this body, the jellyfish seemed to have gone on strike due to being unable to withstand the pressure, and now the cultist's body began to collapse from the place where the chains coexisted. Could it be that the body would collapse once the coexisting demon dies as well? Was this a characteristic of the annihilation cultists? In an instant, Duncan thought of the most likely possibility and even considered Shirley and Dog. Were their relationships similar as well? He could have a good chat with Shirley when he got back. But first, he needed to think about what to do now. Duncan looked helplessly at his rapidly deteriorating body and couldn't help but think of the body he had occupied when he first emerged from the coffin. Although the reasons for the collapse differed, that body also seemed to have experienced a breakdown of flesh in the end. How can finding a usable body be so difficult? He couldn't help but sigh, lamenting his bad luck. It was much smoother back in planned. He looked up at the iron fence at the edge of his field of vision. The cemetery entrance was up ahead, and a vast, desolate area lay beyond the entrance. Only after crossing that empty space would he reach the brightly lit bustling city. Frost's civilized world was just before him, but this constantly deteriorating body might not be able to make it that far, and even if he ran into the city right now, his smoky and crumbling appearance would hardly help him gather any useful information. On the contrary, he would surely attract the attention of night patrol guards. He glanced back at the cemetery one more time. There were quite a few bodies in the morgue, but first, it was difficult to ensure he wouldn't encounter another low-quality one. Second, opening the boxes took a considerable amount of effort. Ads by PubFuture. This was a true blind box opening, and he had already spent enough time messing around tonight. After briefly weighing his options, Duncan lifted his head and looked towards the light coming from another direction on the path. That should be the direction of the caretaker's cabin. Duncan still remembered that there were two cultists disguised as death priests who went to the cabin with the caretaker. Although the caretaker seemed stubborn and unsociable, he was at least a dutiful person in comparison. Cultists were not good people, and there's no reason to let bad people roam about. There seemed to be some noise coming from outside. In the cozy caretaker's cabin, the kettle on the stove was making a hissing sound, and a gas lamp beside it brought bright light to the room. The old caretaker was leisurely tinkering with the bottles and jars on the wooden shelves, and his trusty double-barreled shotgun hung on an iron hook next to the shelves. Two men in black clothes were observing the old man's actions in the cabin, one standing at the door and the other by the window. But their attention was not entirely on the caretaker. They were paying attention to the movement at the cemetery entrance, waiting for a signal. However, they didn't get the "mission accomplished, withdraw" code. Instead, they only heard some faint, unclear, and strange noises coming from the direction of the path. The last faint scream was particularly unsettling. "Did you hear any noises?" The old caretaker suddenly stopped, looked up at the window that seemed dirty and dim due to the passage of time, and listened to the sounds outside. Only the hollow sound of the wind seemed to remain in the darkness of the night. "No noise," the tall, sturdy man standing at the door said immediately after hearing the caretaker's words. Although he was somewhat uneasy, keeping the caretaker in the cabin was a higher priority at the moment, probably just crows. "Oh, crows," the old caretaker muttered. "Crows are very annoying creatures. They steal your food and then stand on tree branches, laughing loudly. I hate thieves and uninvited guests the most, and crows have taken both." The two men in black looked at each other in confusion, seemingly thinking that the stubborn old man's words were somewhat inexplicable. The old caretaker didn't seem to care about their reactions and continued, "By the way, do you know why I followed that lady's advice and brought you two to my cabin?" The shorter man in black seemed to be on guard, staring into the old caretaker's eyes. "Why?" The old caretaker finally found what he was looking for among the bottles and jars. He unscrewed the lid, poured some crushed herbs into the stove, and casually said, "Because generally speaking, two people are easier to deal with than four." A potent aroma of herbal medicine permeated the room. However, it wasn't that the scent had filled the room. Rather, it seemed to have been present all along, only revealing itself to the uninvited guests at that very moment as the elderly gravekeeper spoke. The fragrance's sudden presence caught them by surprise. The two men in black responded almost instantly. The shorter man abruptly lifted his hand, pointing at the old gravekeeper near the stove, and emitted a low, raspy, peculiar sound, as if two voices were overlapping. His companion swiftly pulled out several stained, filthy pieces of paper from his pocket, tossing them into the air. The strange, raspy noise transformed into a barely visible ripple, akin to a shockwave from an explosion, enveloping the area around the old gravekeeper. The airborne pieces of paper fragmented into countless pieces, morphing into numerous black, venomous insects and scorpions upon hitting the ground. They skittered towards the stove, producing a sickening rustling noise. The old gravekeeper hunched over, observing the incoming dangerous assaults without making any attempt to evade them. The shockwave obliterated the shelves beside the stove, shattering bottles and jars with a loud crash and destroying the lit stove, extinguishing the flames responsible for the potent herbal scent. The swarm of venomous insects and scorpions then crawled onto the old man's body, eagerly biting into his flesh. This rapidly overwhelmed the target. His stooped, elderly frame collapsed to the ground, transforming into a gruesome heap of blood and torn clothing. All of this transpired within a matter of seconds. It wasn't until the gravekeeper crumpled to the floor and the stove's ashes dispersed across the ground that the two men in black exchanged nervous glances. Both wore the same bewildered expressions. "Is that it?" The taller man gazed skeptically at the destruction before them, addressing his companion. "Are these fabled, bizarre, and perilous tomb gravekeepers this easy to defeat? Or was this old man merely the weakest among them? The shorter man, however, refused to let his guard down. He continued to fixate on where the old gravekeeper had once stood while also rapidly scanning the small room from the corner of his eye. His eyebrows furrowed. Odd, can you smell that? The herbal aroma is intensifying. It's as if someone nearby is burning incense. Wait. We need to leave. The shorter man appeared to suddenly grasp the situation and hurried toward the wooden door of the adjacent hut. Yet, when he tried to push the door open, it remained as unyielding as a wall. The seemingly flimsy wood felt as sturdy as steel. An elderly, somber voice echoed throughout the hut. One of death's illusions is believing you are trapped in a room with an exit right before your eyes. You attempt to pass through that exit but cannot find the proper way to open the door. The abrupt noise startled the two men in black, amplifying the growing dread they were already feeling, which often morphed into futile anger. Finally, the shorter man abandoned his efforts to push open the door and pivoted to yell at the air, "I don't care where you're hiding." As his words echoed, illusory ripples materialized around him, revealing a grotesque bird-like creature perched on his shoulder within the ripples. The creature, a death crow demon, extended its neck and screeched. The shadow demon's screech and the short man's bellow overlapped, generating a semi-transparent shockwave that instantly swept across the room. Sounds of furniture ripping apart and ornaments shattering filled the air as the small gravekeeper's cottage plunged into chaos instantly. The invisible shockwave destroyed nearly everything, except for the area surrounding the other man in black. The tall, muscular man had raised a barrier to block the residual shockwave while scanning his surroundings, attempting to locate the concealed gravekeeper within the distorted air. He had already deduced the gravekeeper's tactic: it was an illusion. An illusion triggered by the burning of a powerful hallucinogen. The gravekeeper employed extraordinary abilities in herbal medicine to conceal himself, manipulating illusions in the cottage. However, since his voice persisted, it meant he was hiding nearby. All they needed to do was sweep the entire room, and the old man would eventually expose himself. Yet, he found nothing. The shockwave tore through the room, agitating the air but failing to force the gravekeeper to reveal his location. Another dying illusion. Fear and anger intensify, leading to an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. At times, one may feel invincible, as if they could reverse life and death, but this illusion often vanishes in a fleeting moment, followed by emptiness and heightened fear. The elderly voice resonated within the cottage, and for some reason, the two men in black suddenly sensed that the voice seemed evasive, drawing nearer and then receding like light and shadow through a curtain. The scent of demons. I know who both of you are now. You are followers of the Annihilation sect. Your disguises were effective, deceiving my eyes but not my intuition. The old gravekeeper continued, why have you come here? What is your purpose? O great Nether Lord, grant us courage and pure essence. The short man shouted, forcibly suppressing his fear with his devotion to the Nether Lord and progressively succumbing to a fanaticism of sacrifice. Go ahead and gloat, you foolish worldly imitations. Your victory will only be temporary. With that, the cultist suddenly produced a pitch-black dagger from his chest and, without any hesitation, drove it into his own heart. Nether Lord, bestow upon me the power to transcend life and death. In a dire situation, unable to confront the gravekeeper using their own abilities, the cultist opted to offer his heart to the Nether Lord, unleashing the power he had gained through the symbiotic contract, in a final, desperate attempt. However, the anticipated demise did not occur. He didn't experience the intense pain that should have accompanied the dagger penetrating his body. In fact, he couldn't even feel his own heart. The Annihilator looked up in disbelief, glancing at his nearby companion, only to see that the figure had already collapsed to the ground at some unknown moment, a gaping hole in his back and blood drained out. In the final seconds before his vision rapidly faded and his thoughts grew increasingly disordered, he recognized the horrific wound caused by a close-range blast from a double-barreled shotgun. His companion had been dead for some time, killed by a shot from behind by the old guard the instant they entered the guard's cabin. As for himself, the short-statured Annihilator lowered his gaze, realizing that he was actually seated in a chair at the center of the room. A red-hot pair of tongs were brutally lodged between his chest and abdomen, with wisps of green smoke rising from where the tongs made contact with his flesh. Ads by PubFuture. He remembered that he had been defeated in a brief yet intense struggle, killed by a pair of tongs, just 10 seconds prior. So that's it, a person cannot die twice. The cultist muttered something, tilted his head, and ceased breathing entirely. The death illusion has ended. May your souls scatter without blessings or suffering. Across the room on another chair, the gloomy-tempered old guard observed the cultist who had stopped breathing completely, murmuring emotionlessly. Beside him was the trusty old double-barreled shotgun, with remnants of the brief struggle strewn about. The old man paused to catch his breath for a moment, regaining some energy before reaching for the shotgun beside him and using his knees to lift himself from the chair. Utterly useless, only 2 heretics and I'm already in such a state without getting any useful information, the old guard grumbled, stepping over the large body on the floor and the other corpse in the chair, clutching his shotgun and heading towards the wooden door of the cabin. There are still 2 problems outside, I hope I'm not too late. He reached the door, hand ready to open it, but suddenly halted. A peculiar presence was drawing near. The old man's eyes showed a sense of caution, and he gripped his shotgun tightly. The next second, a knock on the door came from the other side. Knock, knock, knock. In the cold, quiet winter night, the sudden knocking had a piercing effect. The old man remained silent, fixated on the dark, aged wooden door as the knocking persisted patiently. It wasn't a living person outside. The old man squinted, and in his line of sight, there stood a pale and dim figure beyond the door, surrounded by some distorted and jumbled light and shadow, but he couldn't discern what it was. Not a living person, but certainly not a dead one either. What was it? Please open the door, thank you, a courteous voice emerged from outside. The old guard slowly aimed his shotgun through the door at the hazy silhouette outside. However, a soft clicking sound suddenly reached his ears before he could fire. The door opened on its own and a brilliant and twisted display of starlight flooded in. Oh no. The instant he saw the distorted radiance, the old guard realized he had unwittingly stumbled into an exceedingly perilous situation. On this cold, dark night, an unfathomable and indescribable being had come knocking at his door, and even more dangerously, he had lit a potent incense just minutes earlier to extract secrets from the souls of the 2 cultists. The incense was potent enough to create the desired dying illusion in the minds of the deceased and could significantly augment the caster's range of perception and mental sharpness. This enabled him to successfully discern the breath of the enigmatic demon from the most subtle consciousness fluctuations of the 2 cultists. However, the side effect was a temporary increase in his spiritual vision, which left him almost defenseless against the reality of the visitor. The dazzling, twisted starlight swirled wildly outside the door, faintly outlining an enormous, giant-like presence. It seemed like 10,000 roars overlapped into a piercing scream that wreaked havoc in his mind. Each scream appeared to rip his soul apart as the old guard stood there rigidly, witnessing a ray of starlight stretching towards him. The front of the starlight abruptly blossomed as if numerous eyes were shifting within. Duncan observed the old man holding the shotgun before him and peeked past him. Inside, he saw the 2 lifeless bodies. The cultists had been taken care of. The seemingly frail old man in front of him appeared to possess strength beyond his expectations. It seems the trouble has been dealt with, and that's good, Duncan smiled, nodding gently. I wanted to help, concerned that you might be in danger. As he spoke, he glanced down at his current state and quickly added, I know I look a bit terrifying and highly suspicious right now. The reasons are complex, and the situation was critical, so I had to temporarily use an inferior shell. This body is gradually falling apart, but rest assured, sir, I'm not an evil person. Amid the rumbling and buzzing, human speech seemed to blend in. A few intelligible words, combined with an extensive amount of knowledge, flooded all his senses. The old guard faced the starlight giant in an invisible storm, realizing that the other party was attempting to converse with him. The indescribable visitor on this wintry night appeared to want to convey something to him. But he couldn't hear anything clearly. One thing he knew for certain, he was the guardian of the cemetery. He could not allow this suspicious entity to remain on this land designated for the deceased to rest. With tense muscles, he surely but slowly raised his double-barreled shotgun. Then, under immense mental strain and chaotic thought interference, he aimed the gun at the seemingly godlike powerful individual. "Leave," he said indistinctly, then raised his voice a little, "leave. Don't disturb them." Duncan furrowed his brow, but he soon understood the old guard's intense reaction at the moment. After all, he didn't appear to be a benevolent person at all. Emitting black smoke, with inch-long cracks in his skin, and shedding half a pound of coal ash when laughing, the old man was only pointing his gun at him without immediately firing. This could only mean that there might not be any bullets in the gun. "It's time for me to go," Duncan said, taking a step back without being bothered by the old man's strong reaction. "I just wanted to assess the situation." He sensed that the body's collapse had reached its limit, and his mind, projected from the vanished, was gradually detaching from the crumbling vessel. "My first visit today was rather hectic, with numerous incidents occurring," he told the elderly caretaker, a faint smile on his lips. "However, our prior conversation was quite enjoyable. I hope we can meet again in a calmer and more stable setting. Farewell." As his spirit retreated from the corpse, which had been rapidly deteriorating due to the death of the symbiotic demon, it finally crumbled entirely. Without Duncan's support, it fell backward and shattered into dry, fragmented charcoal upon impact with the ground. The immense pressure and deafening noise the old caretaker experienced dissipated following the inexplicable presence's departure. The twisted starlight before his eyes were now replaced by a constant ringing, accompanied by a feeling of emptiness. Amid the persistent ringing in his ears, he observed the cemetery's winding path under the gas streetlight's glow. The overlapping shadows of blinking eyes and whispering foulness now filled his senses. Shutting his eyes right away, the old gravekeeper silently recited the name of the death god in his mind before opening them again. The unsettling sight persisted but somewhat improved. At least he could better discern the real world and the corrupted version. It was the residue of madness, and he knew it. But fortunately, it wasn't permanent or total insanity. As to how long this effect would last, he didn't know. In any regard, he shouldn't stay outside with a deteriorated mental state. Who knows what he would do right now if he encountered another living person? Whatever needed to be investigated next would have to wait until sunrise. The old gravekeeper considered for a moment, then turned and returned to the cabin, promptly locking the door and windows while battling the ongoing dizziness and ringing in his ears. Trusting his memory, he located the herbs and sacred oil amidst the chaotic shadows and contorted objects, sprinkling them in the room's four corners. After completing these tasks, he approached the room's center, pushed the still warm corpse off the chair onto the floor, seated himself, donned a death emblem on his chest, grasped the double-barreled shotgun, and silently awaited the next sunrise. In the captain's quarters aboard the Vanished, Duncan sighed softly and glanced at the individual beside him. I tilted her head, gazing at Duncan, and suddenly blurted out, "Our warriors are battling the enemy, the odds are stacked against us." Did Alice pick a fight with something again? Duncan listened to the sounds outside, faintly registering the clangs on the deck and Miss Puppet's sporadic exclamations. However, these noises had become commonplace on the Vanished, so he didn't give them much thought, merely shaking his head. "Let her be, she'll calm down eventually." Ads by PubFuture. As he spoke, he shifted his somewhat stiff neck and peered out the window. Sunrise had not yet arrived, and the boundless sea remained cloaked in the darkness where frost lay in that direction. His hasty journey to the frigid island had been far from smooth. Not only had he failed to find a body suitable for long-term use, but he also couldn't leave the cemetery in the end. Nevertheless, despite the obstacles, he had gained something from this endeavor. Duncan recalled his time in the cemetery, sifting through the information he had collected. Followers of the Nether Lord, the Annihilation Cult, this was the most significant aspect. 4 cultists, masquerading as priests of the death god during the most stringent curfew hours, attempted to steal a corpse from the cemetery, even risking their lives for it. This was no trivial matter. It was expected that the events in the cemetery would be noticed by Frost's authorities and the local church after sunrise, creating a stir among the church's protectors. His emergence from the coffin as a dead man would naturally pique the local church's interest as well. The temporarily inhabited body. Duncan's brow furrowed gradually. This was another vital point. There was clearly something amiss with that corpse. not just because 4 annihilators had risked their lives to steal it in the dead of night, but also due to the peculiar, self-disintegration phenomenon that had transpired later. Duncan looked at his own hands, remembering the vivid image of that body's rapid disintegration. It wasn't his first time occupying a body, but it was the first time he had witnessed such an odd disintegration phenomenon. Even the heartless sacrifice in planned sewers hadn't experienced such a bizarre situation, no matter how dreadful its condition. Simultaneously, Duncan recalled a phrase unintentionally disclosed by one of the cultists: "This body is nearing its limit." Those annihilators apparently knew something. They had anticipated the disintegration phenomenon of that body. Duncan lifted his hand, slowly stroking his chin. He also considered another matter as he speculated on the cultists' motives. Behind these unusual events, was there a link to Morris's friend who returned from the dead? In the southeastern dock area of Planned, an elegant white steamship was undergoing its final preparations. After an extended stay, the White Oak was at last prepared to set sail once more. This time, it would transport numerous commissioned items from the city-state of Planned, journeying through the central and northern shipping routes, heading north, passing Cold Harbor, and ultimately arriving at Frost. The voyage was substantial, but for a ship specifically modified and designed for long-distance, rapid round trips, this route, mainly within safe waters, posed no significant challenge. The powerful steam core guaranteed the ship's impressive propulsion, and the newly refurbished onboard chapel provided adequate protection for all crew members' safety. The sailors working both onshore and onboard seemed quite at ease with this arrangement. Inside the White Oak's engine room at the back, the chief engineer and assistant mechanic oversaw the sailors as they finished the steam core's final preparations. This incredibly powerful machine, as large as a house, was anchored to the ship's main support structure with a sturdy steel frame. It consisted of 3 vertically aligned spherical containers and a series of intricate pipes, valves, and linkage devices surrounding the containers. A metal suspension bridge hung halfway up the 3 containers, allowing sailors to inspect the steam core's operation and perform necessary maintenance. At this moment, several sailors were busily working on the metal suspension bridge. They opened the heavy hatch doors of the spherical containers and removed a few dimly glowing metal rods that were nearly depleted. They then secured several forearm-thick, almost 1 meter long pale gold metal rods in the slots inside the hatch doors, activated the mechanism, and inserted the metal rods into the container's center. These metal catalysts were the source of the steam core's immense power and one of the critical safeguards for the machine's stable operation. Similar to the prayers and incense ceremonies performed by priests near the steam pipes, the alloy catalysts inside the steam core could also help ward off specific malicious forces to some extent, preventing the machine from becoming suddenly possessed after extended operation. The ongoing sounds of pulleys and hinges in motion filled the air. The actions of 2 sailors seemed a bit rough, and the burly bald chief engineer immediately shouted, "Be careful. Don't damage those metal catalysts. They're as soft as breadsticks. If you break one, the captain will have your head. If you're talking about the breadsticks baked by Chef Finley, then you should be worried about damaging the grooves and tenons inside the steam core instead." A sailor on the suspension bridge laughed, but despite his joke, he became more cautious in his movements. "Once we reach Frost, I'll suggest to the captain that we buy a batch of high-quality metal catalysts from there. Gold metal is as cheap as rocks on the ground in that place," the assistant mechanic muttered nearby. She was a woman in her 30s or 40s, with arms as strong as a man's and a work uniform stained with grease. "The Explorers Association's procurement channels are too shady." "That depends on the clients and the church," the chief engineer shrugged. "Half of the cargo hold on the White Oak consists of special, sealed chambers. Many of the items we're transporting this time are raw materials and semi-finished products for sacred relics ordered by the church, and they are quite sensitive. The supplies delivered to the ship have to be strictly inventoried. Once, the Grey Raven had a fool smuggle a barrel of honey wine on board, which loosened the seals of the chambers, allowing 2 shadows to escape and kill half the crew." "I know, so I'll just suggest it to the captain when the time comes." The assistant mechanic waved her hand dismissively, then frowned slightly. "Speaking of which, the captain hasn't arrived yet, and he's not usually late." "The captain will come," the chief engineer said, pausing for emphasis before repeating, the captain will come, he hasn't retired yet. You really should retire, his wife said, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe, her expression stern and her gaze as sharp as ever. Don't wait until I have to come to the ship and pull you by the ear before you realize how serious your situation is. Lawrence didn't respond. He simply adjusted his captain's uniform in the mirror, checked his meticulously combed hair, and solemnly picked up the hat beside him. He only allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief once it was on his head. "Thank you, Martha, but I must be going," the old captain whispered. "The White Oak is waiting at the port." His wife watched him in silence, without angry words or endless complaints, only a long, silent stare. After what felt like an eternity, she finally sighed softly, "Fine, be careful and come back soon, don't run into any more trouble." Hopefully, Lawrence sighed helplessly and turned away from the mirror. "Did you bring everything?" "I brought everything. The house keys and the amulet for going out. I have them. I didn't forget. Bring a small prayer book, it'll be helpful." "I brought that too." Lawrence bent down to pick up the small suitcase by the door and patted it. "I also have a few handwritten prayers and some holy candles from the cathedral." His wife opened her mouth as if to say something more, but Lawrence turned to her with a smile. "I've brought everything. I'm not so old that I forget things." His wife fell silent for a moment and then exhaled softly, "Your medicine." Lawrence's movements froze. "Your medicine, don't forget it," she repeated. Lawrence's lips trembled slightly, and his gaze gradually shifted to the side. A small brown glass bottle sat quietly on the small table by the door. The sunlight fell on the bottle, revealing the clear texture of the liquid inside. After a long silence, Lawrence picked up the bottle of medicine. Several seconds passed before he opened the tiny stopper. He looked up at Martha and saw that his wife was still leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching him, just as she had always been. "Safe travels," she mouthed the words. "I'm leaving now," Lawrence replied softly. Then, as the psychiatrist had instructed, he placed a few drops of the medicine in his mouth. The strong taste spread within, and his wife's figure quietly faded in the sunlight. Ads by PubFuture. Lawrence silently put the cap back on the medicine bottle, opened the small suitcase, and placed the remaining medicine in a corner where it wouldn't get bumped. As he organized his things, he grumbled, "That psychiatrist is just fooling people, this stuff is so bitter. There's no herbal aroma at all." The old captain, who had spent half his life wandering the boundless sea, finished preparing his belongings, sighed softly, picked up his suitcase, and left home. After a day's work, Heidi finally returned home before evening. She pushed open the door, took off her coat, and the first thing she did after entering the living room was to ungracefully collapse into a chair with a deep sigh. Meanwhile, her mother sat by the warm fireplace, sorting through some letters that had just come today. Hearing her daughter come home, the old lady turned her head slightly. "You're a grown woman now. Try to be mindful of your appearance, a lady wouldn't behave like this." "Let the lady rest for a bit, she's been dealing with strange nightmares and sailors spouting nonsense all day." Heidi slumped in the chair, weakly waving her hand. There was a ship with a mechanical failure on the boundless sea, stranded for nearly twice the planned time. Several sailors were carried off the ship, bound hand and foot. It was a disaster. She took a breath and shook her head, lamenting, making a living on the boundless sea is not an easy task. Her mother looked up from the letters. "Sounds awful. In that case, you shouldn't be slumped like this. Hurry upstairs and take a bath to relax, the water is already heated." "Fine, you're right," Heidi pouted, finally mustering the energy to get up from the chair. She walked towards the stairs, but suddenly stopped, curious. "These letters are water bill, electricity bill, gas bill, all sorts of bills, miscellaneous stuff," her mother said casually. "Your father used to handle them, but since he's away, I'm taking care of it." "All right, I don't want to deal with this stuff," Heidi said, waving her hand and heading upstairs. Her mother watched her daughter go up the stairs silently, then looked back at the letters in front of her. Most of them were indeed bills. But there were also 2 real letters, one of them from a place unimaginable to most people. It was a letter from Morris, delivered this afternoon by a messenger engulfed in green flames. The letter bore the special spell of the God of Wisdom to prevent outsiders from seeing its true content. The old woman looked at the familiar handwriting with a smile. "I'm on my way to Frost. There isn't much scenery to see along the way, only the occasional small ice floes on the sea and the distant cold mist are quite interesting." Nina was doing her winter break homework in the dining hall today when a strange shadow emerged from her textbook. Everyone fought to beat it, creating quite a lively scene. Before lunch, the captain went fishing again, you know, that kind of fish. It put up quite a fight this time, making for a thrilling scene. The captain claimed that lively fish taste better, but I honestly couldn't tell the difference. The old lady smiled and momentarily set the letter aside, picking up another recently opened letter. This letter, however, came from Frost. The sender was Scott Brown. Mary, Morris's wife, gazed at the letter's envelope for an extended period before gingerly retrieving an envelope opener from the side and carefully opening it. A slim, folded piece of paper slipped out of the envelope. Before unfolding it, Mary noticed uneven indentations on the paper's back. These marks indicated forceful handwriting, suggesting the author was highly emotional while writing. The older woman, seated near the fireplace, adjusted her position and placed the letter she had already read on a nearby small round table. She glanced at the date stamp on the envelope containing the letter from Frost. It was sent on December 5th. Just 3 days after sending the first letter, the late Scott Brown wrote this second one. As Mary opened the folded note, she saw several lines of untidy, rushed handwriting, strikingly different from the elegant and neat writing of the folklorist in the letter sent only days prior. The lines conveyed immense anxiety and fear. "My friend, something is wrong. I can't explain it to you. I'm very confused right now, finding it hard to think. Something is disturbing my mind, my memory. Don't come to Frost. Never come to Frost under any circumstances. Even if you receive other letters or invitations from me, never come to Frost. There is a massive conspiracy. Don't come to Frost." The note lacked a signature, and even the envelope's stamp was askew. Mary stared at the hastily penned words, envisioning a folklorist, his mental state in disarray from overwhelming cognitive dissonance, using his last bit of sanity to write these sentences. She imagined him struggling through Frost's icy wind to deliver the letter to the post office. She quietly refolded the paper and returned it to the envelope. The letter was disquieting, exuding a sinister aura from beginning to end. Ordinarily, it would have been enough to make the recipient seek sanctuary in a church. However, Mary's eyes scanned the small round table next to her, examining the letter from the vanished. The deep-sea offspring heirs do have a distinct taste, more delectable than common fish. The captain has honed special cooking techniques, and Anomaly 099, Miss Alice, has acquired the essence of it. Perhaps I should attempt it as well. The elderly woman wordlessly tossed the letter from Frost into the nearby fireplace, watching it quickly burn and turn to ash in the bright flames. "They've already left," she whispered before rising and gathering ink, a pen, and writing paper from the adjacent shelf, preparing to write a letter. This one would be sent to the antique shop in the lower city district. Church personnel in black coats were walking around the cemetery, checking all the remaining traces here. Every path, coffin, and street lamp was marked and sampled, hoping to reconstruct the events that had taken place the night before. Gatekeeper Agatha stayed in the caretaker's hut, with the gloomy, hunchbacked old caretaker sitting across from her. After an unknown amount of time, the young woman, who was mostly wrapped in bandages, raised her head and looked at the sky outside the window, seeing the sun gradually sinking and a faint reddish glow beginning to spread across the sky above the city. Evening was approaching. Her guards had been busy in the cemetery for several hours, and the old caretaker in front of her had been silent for the same amount of time. Strictly speaking, the old caretaker wasn't just silent, he was maintaining a state of near mental closure, not moving, speaking, and reacting to external stimuli. Since the church guards received the report and came here, he had been sitting quietly in that chair, like a breathing flesh sculpture. A black-clad guard pushed open the wooden door of the caretaker's hut, came to Agatha's side, bent down, and whispered something to her. She nodded slightly. "I understand. Send the samples to the cathedral first, and leave the scene as it is. Tonight might be crucial. We need to have someone on watch. The black-clad guard nodded and took his leave, but before leaving, he couldn't help but look at the old man sitting motionlessly in the chair. The young guard's face showed apparent unease at seeing the old man's stagnant, murky eyes. How long will he maintain this state? Is it really okay? Protective mental closure. He's using this method to fight and cleanse the contamination he's been exposed to, and possibly to protect us as well, Agatha whispered. The gravekeeper must have encountered something unimaginable last night. He seems to have struggled back from the edge of madness, but don't worry, he's an experienced warrior and has successfully stabilized his condition. He'll be fine. At this point, Agatha paused and added, as for how long this state will last, that's hard to say. It might end in the next second, or it might not be until this time tomorrow. It depends on how long he was exposed to that terrible contamination. The black-clad guard thought for a moment, looked up at the window, and through the slightly dirty glass, saw the bustling church personnel outside on the path. Then he turned his gaze back to the two bodies in the hut, two intruders who had been confirmed as followers of annihilation and had apparently died at the hands of the old caretaker. Due to the unclear situation and to protect the scene, the two bodies were still left in place. They couldn't possibly be the cause of the old caretaker's mental closure. Even the demons behind them going out of control wouldn't be at this level. What could it be? A more powerful shadow demon? A high priest of the annihilation cult? Or something else entirely? Ads by PubFuture. The black-clad guard voiced his doubts, but Agatha just shook her head. No, it should be an even more dangerous and mysterious situation. Why are you so sure? The black-clad guard asked subconsciously. Because there were really only traces left by a few heretical believers at the scene, as well as a pile of annihilator corpse remains that didn't leave any supernatural reactions, Agatha said calmly. The lack of any observable traces means. It means that the visitor last night did nothing. Their mere presence in this cemetery for a moment was enough to push my mind to the brink. The old man's voice suddenly sounded in the hut, interrupting the exchange between the black-clad guard and the gatekeeper. Agatha immediately looked in the direction of the voice, and a faint smile finally appeared on her expressionless face. You're back, that's good. I wouldn't say completely back, the old caretaker slowly said, gradually stabilizing the various perceptions that were slightly off after reopening his mind. He looked into Agatha's eyes, consciously blocking out the jumping afterimages behind her, but at least I can distinguish which part belongs to reality and which part belongs to madness now. That's enough. Agatha nodded. What happened yesterday? The corpse you sent suddenly became agitated, talking like a living person. Then 4 followers of annihilation entered the cemetery, wanting to take away the agitator. They used the power of shadow demons to disguise themselves, skillfully hiding their identities as experienced summoners. They deceived my eyes but not my intuition. I lured 2 of them here and killed them, these 2 on the floor. Then, as I was preparing to go to the cemetery to kill the other 2, something unexpected happened. The old caretaker raised his head, looking in the direction of the door. An indescribable visitor came by. I stared at it for a while, or maybe just a few seconds. My sense of time was off, so I can't be sure. An indescribable visitor. Agatha couldn't help but frown. Can you be more specific? The old caretaker tried to recall. All that came to his mind were chaotic lights and shadows and an overwhelming noise. The hasty mental closure had eliminated the temporary contamination he had suffered, but it had also erased some useful memories. I can't. I only remember chaotic lights and shadows and noise, the old caretaker shook his head. And even if I could accurately describe what I saw, it wouldn't make sense to you. What I saw may not have been real, and even if it was real, it may not be the same reality that others see. As humans, our ways of perception are too limited. All right, then that's the whole answer, Agatha nodded. An indescribable visitor came to the cemetery at the final stage but didn't actively cause any destruction. Are you sure you want to use the word visit in the report? This word is neutral, even friendly. Yes, the old caretaker answered calmly. I had a conversation with it, although we hardly communicated anything successfully. The visitor tried to communicate, which is a neutral or even friendly signal. Understood. I've recorded it. Agatha nodded again. What happened next? Anything else? After the visitor left, I vaguely saw that they left something, on the path at the entrance, the old caretaker said as he recalled. But I couldn't see it clearly. At that time, my vision was severely damaged, and my cognition was also greatly affected, so I'm not sure. If you're talking about a pile of remains burned by the backlash of shadow demons, we found it, Agatha calmly interrupted the old caretaker. If that's correct, then it seems to be the visitor's vessel. Outside the hut, on the path leading to the morgue, the charred remains that barely retained a human outline still lay in place. Several church guardians were preparing to move the wreckage into wooden crates. Upon seeing the gatekeeper and the cemetery caretaker appear, they temporarily stopped their actions. The gatekeeper, Agatha, pointed at the burnt remains. What you saw yesterday should be him. Of course, what remains here now is only a shell. The visitor that once occupied this shell has indeed left. The old caretaker came to the side of the remains, looked down, and observed for a moment, then furrowed his brow slightly. He is, if I'm not mistaken, one of the 4 cultists disguised as priests last night, Agatha said calmly. This shell died due to the backlash of a symbiotic demon. The old caretaker remained silent with a serious expression, not knowing what he was pondering. Then 2 minutes later, he suddenly looked up and said, "The corpse you sent last night." Agatha nodded, raising her hand to point in another direction, "Over here, but its condition is even more bizarre." Under the gatekeeper's guidance, the old caretaker arrived at an empty space at the edge of the morgue, where processed samples and other key evidence to be sent back to the cathedral were stored. The old caretaker stared in astonishment at what Agatha pointed out to him. It was a collection of large and small glass jars. "You mean, this is the corpse you sent yesterday? The restless one, who chatted with me in the coffin for half the night?" The old man stared at the jars for a long time before finally turning his head to look at Agatha suspiciously. Just a night before, he could even energetically knock on the coffin. "Yes, but when the guardians found these things, we could only use shovels to collect them and then put them in jars as much as possible. Their remaining outline and location can only prove that this is indeed the deceased we sent to the cemetery last night." Agatha shook her head. "As you can see, a semi-solid sludge, barely retaining traces of biological tissue. Even those remaining traces are rapidly turning into sludge-like substances as time goes by." She paused, pointing to one of the largest jars. "There were a few bones in here originally, but now there is only this strange, viscous substance." The old caretaker frowned, staring intently at the bizarre material in the glass jars. Those dark red, mixed with black and gray substances, resembled the mud at the bottom of the water. If it wasn't for knowing that the gatekeeper would not deceive him, he could not associate these things with the restless one who chatted in the coffin yesterday in any way. "All right, the dead have turned into sludge, and strange things always happen together," the old caretaker finally sighed. "At this point, how should I explain all this to the deceased's family? They will come to the cemetery to say goodbye to their loved ones. Am I supposed to tell them that a few annihilators snuck in yesterday to cause trouble? That there was something like a subspace shadow visiting, so their family member somehow turned into a few jars of liquid? Oh, you don't need to worry about that. Their family won't bother you," Agatha said emotionlessly, shaking her head. "They have already completed the farewell ceremony in the neighboring cemetery No. 4. The miner who died from the fall will be sent to the furnace as scheduled." The old caretaker blinked, his expression suddenly turning serious. "You deceived the deceased's family with a different body." "We haven't stooped that low," Agatha replied lightly. "Then, we found another body. Today at noon, a worker who died from a fall was found in the shaft. He looked exactly like the corpse we sent here last night." The old caretaker stared wide-eyed, his expression slightly stiff. After a while, he suddenly came to his senses and instinctively turned his head to look at the simple coffin on the platform not far away, the coffin that had been sent to the cemetery last night. Then he looked back at the eerie glass jars in the sample storage area. "In the name of the god of death, what on earth did you bring here yesterday?" "We will investigate," Agatha said, her face showing a rare hint of seriousness. "Now, the only thing that is certain is that the body sent to cemetery number 4 should be the real one. It didn't show any agitation nor did it collapse and dissolve. while the body we sent here last night was tampered with by supernatural forces. The old caretaker didn't speak for a while, seemingly deep in thought. At that moment, a black-clothed church guardian suddenly approached from another path and came directly to Agatha. The church guardian quickly reported something to Agatha in a low voice, then handed over a thick piece of paper. Agatha glanced at the paper's contents, showing no change in expression, and nodded slightly, understood. "What happened?" the old caretaker casually asked. "Do you remember those 4 heretics who entered your cemetery yesterday?" Agatha raised her head, handing the paper directly to the old man. "You killed 2, 1 turned into charred remains outside your hut, and now we have found the whereabouts of the last annihilator." The old caretaker took the paper and saw that it was a photograph. On a cement floor somewhere, there was a pile of sludge that could barely be recognized as human, with clear signs of charring, just like the charred remains at the entrance of his hut. Obviously, it was the backlash after the symbiotic relationship with the demon was severed. "It's that woman," the old caretaker frowned, looking up at Agatha. "She's dead." "How did she die?" "Where?" 2 blocks away, in broad daylight, this pile of sludge suddenly fell at a crossroad, Agatha said. Along with it, there was an obviously out-of-control death crow. That demon lasted only a few seconds in the real world before it collapsed and disappeared. Bystanders at the scene reported the incident to the security officer. Ads by PubFuture. The old caretaker thought for a moment and shook his head gently. "I'm not an expert in this field, just tell me your opinion directly." "My opinion is that this heretic probably saw the same visitor you saw last night. The eyes of a demon are more likely to see the truth, so her death crow went mad, and in its madness, took its master into the depths of the demon's realm," Agatha calmly analyzed. "Judging from the aftermath, this heretic was torn apart by other demons before being backlashed by the symbiotic contract, which is a typical characteristic of falling unprotected into the depths of the demon realm." The gatekeeper finished speaking calmly and took a deep breath, her gaze staring into the old caretaker's eyes. "I feel there's something watching over this city. The days ahead may not be peaceful." Duncan arrived at the dining room before evening. Although he didn't know when it started, the place seems to have unconsciously become a gathering place for the crew during their leisure time. As soon as Duncan entered, he saw Morris correcting Nina's homework while Nina was supervising Shirley, Dog, and Alice's spelling at another nearby table. Meanwhile, Vanna sat near the window, carefully reading a church book. The atmosphere seemed quite good. "A letter from your wife." Duncan went straight to Morris and handed him a letter. "From Mary." Morris stopped correcting the homework, somewhat surprised as he looked at the letter handed over by the captain. He then took out a letter opener he carried with him, mumbling as he opened the envelope. "I said in the letter that there was no need to rush a reply. Anyway, the postage only costs a few fries," Duncan said with a smile. "Take a look at what's written inside. Maybe it's urgent." Morris nodded, took out the letter paper, and glanced at it quickly before frowning involuntarily. "What does the letter say?" Duncan asked curiously but added, "You don't have to say if it's private." Scott Brown's second letter arrived, only 3 days apart from the first one. Morris didn't hide it but spoke with a strange tone. His mental state in the letter is obviously not quite right. Mary was worried that the letter carried unclean things, so she burned the original but recounted the contents of the letter. Brown urged me nervously and anxiously not to approach Frost. "It seems that your friend has noticed some truth," Duncan said thoughtfully after listening. "Unfortunately, my investigation of Frost didn't go smoothly, and I couldn't find out about your friend." "Ah, you went to Frost to investigate." Morris was suddenly surprised, unable to help but exclaim, "When did you go?" "Just last night." Duncan didn't hide it, as they were all among his own people. "I borrowed a body. Unfortunately, I couldn't find out much information. It wasn't this troublesome last time in planned." As soon as his voice fell, there was a sudden plop from not far away. Duncan and Morris both looked in the direction of the sound and saw that Vanna's book had fallen to the floor. The expression on Miss Inquisitor's face was somewhat strange, causing Morris to grow worried from his end. "Vanna, are you all right?" "She's fine." Duncan waved his hand and answered for Vanna. "She just has a bit of PTSD." The captain often employed peculiar and enigmatic vocabulary, which was challenging to comprehend and creatively formed. Nevertheless, the crew on the Vanished didn't mind this. After all, there was a dove on the ship that used even more peculiar and incomprehensible terms, and communication between the captain and the dove had always been seamless, proving that these unusual words were not an issue with the captain. It was an issue with the limited understanding of ordinary people. In any case, those who couldn't understand would simply regard it as a subspace dialect. Morris didn't inquire about the meaning of PTSD, but quietly processed the information the captain had just shared. Duncan was forthcoming and shared his experience in the graveyard the previous night. He mainly sought the opinions of professionals. Duncan's narration quickly drew the attention of several people in the dining area. Nina was the first to approach, followed by Shirley, Alice, and Dog. Eventually, even Vanna, who had been quietly keeping to herself, couldn't suppress her curiosity and discreetly moved closer to eavesdrop near the long table. Annihilators, Morris, the most knowledgeable of the group, was the first to frown after hearing Duncan's story. Why would they be interested in corpses? Shouldn't annihilators be interested in corpses? Duncan asked curiously. They're not necromancers. Morris shook his head. Annihilators follow the Nether Lord, exploring the knowledge of demonic and summoning realms. They have no interest in mortal flesh. In fact, they even despise and detest it because they believe that mortal flesh is weak and impure, while the demons of the dark depths and the Nether Lord are the original form, with pure holiness. How could such heretics go to a graveyard to steal corpses? Duncan's brow shot upwards after listening to the elderly scholar's explanation. Annihilators disdain mortal flesh and follow the pure and holy beings of the dark realm. They even believe that the dark demons and the Nether Lord possess this pure holiness. Although he was aware from the start that the cultists in this world held strange beliefs, the Annihilators' challenge to logical limits seemed a bit too outlandish. Duncan couldn't help but glance at Dog beside the table, who had been pulled over by Shirley and was now lying on the floor, diligently studying a vocabulary book with its grotesque skeletal skull swaying back and forth. Noticing the captain's gaze, Dog abruptly looked up, its entire body of terrifying bones rattling. Pure, holy. Duncan observed the dark hound with a peculiar expression, even the original form of life. Dog was taken aback. Huh, what? Unimaginable. Duncan shook his head. The world in the eyes of those annihilators must be entirely different from that of ordinary people. He said this casually, but Shirley instantly responded. Who knows how their brains work? I'm not an annihilation cultist. No one said you were, Duncan replied indifferently. Anyway, I can't say anything else, but that female cultist who escaped must be dead by now. Shirley smacked her lips and continued, absolutely dead and dismembered. Duncan hadn't initially considered the fate of the escaped cultist, but upon hearing Shirley's words, he couldn't help but be taken aback. Why do you say that? She was dragged by her own symbiotic demon into the deep-sea abyss, Shirley nonchalantly explained. The Annihilators, those fools may worship the Nether Lord and bind themselves with shadow demons, but once they enter the true dark depths of the deep-sea plane, they're still treated as humans. Those uncontrollable demons only recognize the scent of their kin and will tear her apart. She'll be torn apart by other shadow demons. Duncan murmured, and then couldn't help but recall previous events. Wait, but I remember you and Dog also used a similar method to escape before. Right in front of me, you both jumped into a rift leading to the demon's realm. Upon recalling their past exploits, Shirley's expression briefly turned peculiar, but she quickly waved her hand. That's different. When Dog helps me escape, he always does his best to protect me. He tries to confuse my scent, and if he can't, he fights the other shadow demons. So every time we use this method to escape, he ends up injured. And the situation with other shadow demons is different. The one you just mentioned, they wouldn't protect their masters, right, Dog? That's a death crow you're referring to. Dog lifted its head, addressing Shirley while cautiously glancing at Duncan. Ordinary shadow demons indeed won't actively protect their masters. They don't have a heart, and only cooperate with the Annihilators because of the symbiotic contract. Once they enter the deep-sea abyss, they'll lose control immediately, and that cultist is as good as dead. So that's how it is. Duncan stroked his chin, contemplating. no wonder she looked quite reluctant when she was dragged in. At this point, Vanna, who had been standing by silently, finally couldn't help herself. She moved a little closer to the long table. Did those heretics do anything other than try to remove you from the cemetery? Duncan glanced up at Vanna, who hastily added, "It's probably a professional habit. I'm very curious about the purpose of those heretics. As Mr. Morris just mentioned, typical annihilators wouldn't be interested in mortal flesh and blood, so the cultists who appeared in the cemetery are even more suspicious." "Now that you bring it up, it reminds me," Duncan said thoughtfully, stroking his chin. "The body I inhabited at that time experienced a very strange collapse phenomenon not long after leaving the coffin. The skin and muscles fell apart like cracked mud, and those cultists seemed to have anticipated this." Vanna furrowed her brows slightly, and after pondering for a while, she suddenly realized something. "So, the key is the body you inhabited at that time. You mean, annihilators aren't interested in mortal flesh and blood, but what if that wasn't a mortal flesh body?" Vanna looked up, her eyes fixed on Duncan's. "In fact, it might not even be flesh at all." Ads by PubFuture. Listening to Vanna's analysis, Duncan appeared thoughtful. "Oh, well, this is getting interesting." After a long absence, the sea mist finally returned to its home port. At the edge of the secret island shrouded in floating ice, turbulent currents, and fog, the steel warship, with its towering prow, docked smoothly at the end of the pier. The undead sailors were busy amid the cold wind and thin mist, with some inspecting the ship's condition, others tallying cargo or directing the onshore cranes to lift heavy cargo containers from the hold to the shore. The sea mist had returned from the warm central seas. Although it hadn't brought back a victorious report, it had brought gifts and specialties from afar, fine wine and souvenirs given by planned authorities to the Sea Mist Venture Capital Company, as well as tobacco, cloth, and handicrafts purchased by the captain. These items were all perfect for the cold, secluded island. Although the undead had left the world of the living, they still possessed individual personalities and emotions. They required a certain quality of life, entertainment, and hobbies, and in some ways, they needed these things even more than the living. Their souls constantly felt cold and empty, and they needed the warm creations of the civilized world to fill those voids all the more. First Mate Aiden stood at the edge of the deck, meticulously packing fine planned tobacco into an old-fashioned short-stemmed pipe, lighting it with a lighter, and taking a satisfying deep puff. He then held his breath, making an effort. A mist of smoke seeped out from the collar, cuffs, and pocket seams of his sailor's uniform, enveloping his entire upper body in a cloud of white smoke. Aiden rotated his neck, gazed at the smoke around him, and then opened his collar to take a peek. The bullet hole in his chest was still emitting wisps of blue smoke. Warm tobacco can fill the void in the soul, but a physical void is another matter, isn't it? A hoarse, dark voice suddenly emerged from behind. Aiden turned to see an old man with pale skin and a withered figure standing at the edge of the deck. The old man wore a priest's robe, with one side of his skull caved in and the corresponding half of his body displaying a damp texture as if soaked in seawater. That was the shipboard priest of the Sea Mist, Will. The old priest finished speaking, picked up a small liquor bottle, and took a swig. The liquid trickled down from the cracked side of his cheek due to the caved-in skull. Aiden observed the old priest for a moment and suddenly blurted out, "Want me to teach you a trick? You could make that bottle of liquor last for days." "Tricks don't work." The old priest shook his head, "mainly because it's disgusting, and it starts to turn sour after the third time." Aiden shrugged, picked up his pipe, and took another deep puff, holding his breath again, completely enveloped in smoke. "Actually, being undead isn't that bad. I couldn't play like this when I was alive. It's good to have an open mind," the old priest couldn't help but exclaim. Aiden returned to the bridge where Tyrion was waiting for him. "The unloading process is going smoothly, and it will take about an hour to transfer all the goods from the cargo hold to the port warehouse," the bald first mate energetically reported, with every fold of his clothes still exuding the strong smell of tobacco. "The sailors left on the island really enjoyed the local specialties you brought back. There's a party tonight. You're welcome to join if you're interested," Tyrion mentioned casually, then couldn't help but glance at Aiden again, frowning and wrinkling his nose. "Did you smoke so much that you set yourself on fire?" Maybe a bit too much, Aiden admitted awkwardly, touching his nose. Tobacco from plant always makes it hard to let go. Be more careful. You smell like a piece of bacon right now. Tyrion shook his head, cautioned him casually, and then changed the subject. Lately, I've often heard the sailors discussing frost. The news has indeed spread. Aiden's expression grew more serious upon hearing the captain's words. The resurrection of the dead, regardless of the rumor's source, is content enough to spark sailors' discussions. After all, we're all undead. The undead, huh? Tyrion murmured, repeating the term. Are they looking forward to truly coming back to life? To be honest, anyone with a little sense would know that it's impossible, Aiden shrugged. Ordinary people might still fantasize about such topics, but the more one is undead, the more one realizes that true resurrection can only be a rumor. Death's gate is one way, and our souls that have been twisted and changed can no longer pass through it, so we linger in the world as the so-called undead. As for the boundary between life and death, everyone is quite clear about it. After all, everyone had lingered in front of that gate for a while when confronted with death. Tyrion nodded slightly, pondered momentarily, and asked, why has this topic attracted so much discussion? True resurrection won't happen, so everyone is speculating that those so-called revived people might actually be undead, Aiden grinned. You know, most city-states don't like the living dead, and Frost hates them even more, considering it a curse from the outer sea. Although it's not fair to blame the current Frost people for the deaths of half a century ago, everyone is still happy to see the authorities of that city-state in distress. Tyrion raised an eyebrow, watching the show. If this matter is indeed related to the original Abyss plan, then it's not just a show anymore. You're right, I understand that, but for now, most ordinary sailors are just enjoying the fun. Let's talk about other things when the fun gets too big, Aiden said, spreading his hands. Can't help it, that's the mentality of the undead, especially when it comes to Frost. Tyrion silently looked at Aiden, and after a long while, he helplessly waved his hand. True resurrection involves passing through Bartok's gate and returning, and in Frost, the mainstream belief centers around the god of death. Theoretically, the rules of life and death in Frost should be stricter and more stable. The rumors of the dead returning there are quite suspicious. He didn't continue to argue with his first mate about whether it was appropriate to watch the excitement, but instead put on a serious face and steered the conversation back to a more serious tone. I'm more inclined to think that some other supernatural force is at work. We'll have to see how the local silent cathedral reacts, Aiden said. I heard that the current gatekeeper of the cathedral is a newcomer named Agatha, a young inexperienced girl. I don't know if she can handle this kind of trouble. Tyrion didn't speak, but for some reason, he suddenly thought of another young, strong, and powerful high priest who had calmly dealt with his fearsome father multiple times. Inquisitor Vanna of Planned. If it were that formidable and somewhat terrifying Inquisitor, surely handling a few minor resurrection issues wouldn't be a problem. The slightly salty sea breeze blew head-on, carrying a chill that was absent in the Central Sea. Vanna sat on a wooden barrel near the ship's side, gazing up at the endless sea horizon, and saw a faint mist at the edge of her vision, with distant, hazy icebergs hidden deep within the mist. The Vanished had already entered the cold sea, far, far away from Planned. The young Inquisitor lowered her head and continued carving the wooden piece with a small knife. She was crafting new wave amulets from sea breath wood. Life on the Vanished was actually much better than she had initially imagined. None of the frightening or bizarre occurrences had happened. There were normal routines, decent food, clean and private living spaces, and noisy but interesting fellow crew members. From some perspectives, the living conditions on the Vanished were even better than those on ordinary ocean-going ships. Thanks to the messenger, the ship could always replenish fresh supplies, and with plenty of living facilities on board, the Vanished hardly experienced any inconvenience due to equipment failures. However, the ship's biggest advantage was not even this. Its biggest advantage was safety. Yes, safety. It was incredible, but after living here for a few days, Vanna finally confirmed this unbelievable reality. No ship could be safer than this dreaded ghost ship. Because of Captain Duncan's presence, even intruders from subspace didn't dare to cause trouble on this ship. On the Vanished, one could freely discuss subspace matters, read any books, and Morris had I bring a large number of folklore and history books from land that took hours to read. To speed up the journey, the captain would sometimes even let the vanished sink into the spirit world and sail at full speed in that dark and terrifying abnormal sea. There wouldn't be any deep shadows coming out. Even if something really did emerge, it would just become the crew's daily entertainment. Or an extra meal. In summary, life on the Vanished was not bad at all. But she still needed some time to adjust. The small knife slid across the wood, carving deep grooves, and the wood shavings fell off bit by bit, gradually calming her restless emotions. Footsteps approached from behind, and an energetic voice suddenly sounded beside her. "Miss Vanna, what are you doing?" Vanna looked up and saw Nina curiously examining the half-carved amulet in her hand and the several finished amulets on the nearby wooden barrel. Ads by PubFuture. This is an amulet dedicated to the storm goddess Gomona. Vanna smiled, aware of the astonishing identity of the seemingly ordinary girl in front of her, but after a few days of interaction, she was no longer surprised by the identities of any crew members on the ship. Throwing a sea breath wood amulet into the sea is like making an offering to the goddess. Oh, Nina nodded in sudden realization, looking amazed at the finished amulets on the wooden barrel. I think I heard about this in school, but this is the first time I've seen it. You made so many. Actually, Vanna hesitated to speak, then looked into Nina's sparkling eyes and slowly opened the barrel lid. There are more than just these. Nina stared blankly, peeked into the barrel, and continued to be stunned. After a moment, she looked up at the Inquisitor in front of her. "Miss Vanna, are you really bored on the ship?" "Not really," Vanna said with an awkward expression, feeling that carving a barrel of amulets in just a few days seemed a bit excessive. "It's just that, I might need a little more time to adjust." "Oh," Nina nodded, then squatted next to the barrel, lost in thought. Vanna didn't know what she was thinking. Vanna put down a new wave amulet and quietly put away the small knife. "Miss Vanna, aren't you carving anymore? I've run out of material. Should we ask I to bring some more?" "No need." Vanna waved her hand with an awkward expression, but just as she was about to say something else, a strange, deep rumbling sound coming from the sea surface interrupted her words. It sounded like something was moving under the water, rising rapidly with a large number of bubbles. A creaking and clattering noise came almost simultaneously from the direction of the Vanished's mast. The next second, Vanna saw the ghostly sails above the ghost ship adjusting their angles simultaneously while the massive hull adjusted its posture and course. Nina ran to the side of the ship, her eyes wide as she stared at the distant sea, suddenly pointing and shouting, "Look, look! Miss Vanna, something is coming out." Vanna looked in the direction Nina was pointing. She saw a large area of rising waves and foam, with irregular, chaotic currents rising like small hills in the distance and a huge shadow gradually emerging from the water among the currents and foam. A towering flagpole, a rusty bow, a chimney, and a damaged and tattered deck. It was a ship.